A todos, simplemente unas breves palabras para recordarles que esta es la penúltima de las conferencias de esta Cátedra del Prado, que el próximo viernes pues, concluirá esta magnífica experiencia y que espero veros a todos de nuevo aquí. Y os dejo ahora con Elizabeth y con su quinta conferencia que lleva por título Francesco Albani y el final de la escuela de los Carracci. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Miguel, and thanks to all of you for coming to Lecture 5. And it's hard to believe we're almost through, but tonight we'll be looking at the fourth leg that I promised you before a kind of grand summation next week. Other thank yous, just for the moment. Tonight I'd like to just give some thanks to Patrizia Piergiovanni of the Galleria Colonna for real help in getting some very difficult images. And here at the Prado, just a special thank you to Sergio Nieves and Carlos Lorente for keeping the production of the lecture moving so smoothly here in the auditorium. Perhaps I need even more help than I realize. Thank you. As always, to Amaya Bravo for her translation, which I hear is wonderful, and especially to Mar Nogal Castellanos, who's been such a help in both administrative and moral support. So thanks to you all and to many others. So tonight, I hope you can hear me correctly now. Is that good? We are going to move to Carlo Cesare Malvasia's fourth pillar of the Carracci school. I think we've established over the course of the lectures that Malvasia recognized that no artist could be perfect in absolutely everything. And Francesco Albani, our subject tonight, was no exception. Each of the four lives we've been considering contains an encomium of the artist's strengths and expresses a firm belief that each of these Carracci pupils could surpass his masters in some way. Ebbe ogni secolo I suoi virtuosi. Every century has its great figures or its masters, is Malvasia's motto. And Albani, our subject tonight, was prized above all for what Malvasia calls his poetic scherzi. We're going to hear more about that. This view of individual excellence was fundamental to the achievement of the Carracci Academy as they themselves defended it. Unlike the decline into obsequious mannerism that followed the perfection of Michelangelo in Florence, a firm tradition in Bologna could continue into the future as new generations worked like bees to combine nectars and make new things, to use the contemporary metaphor. Roughly contemporaries and definitely rivals, these four pupils we've been looking at justified the addition to Bologna's title of Alma Mater Studiorum, that of Gran Madre della Pittura. In constructing his long and complex book, Malvasia returned repeatedly to these fundamental definitions. We've also seen that Malvasia offset the strengths of these painters with their negative qualities, and in this too, Francesco Albani is no exception. The life in the Felsina Pittrice opens with a reference to a statement by Giorgio Vasari's friend, Vincenzo Borghini, seen on the left, that the most important part of painting is invention, the discovery of subject matter. Malvasia, and also to some extent its disposition. Malvasia insists that this cannot be, for an invention without design remains invisible, whereas Titian and Van Dyck, writes Malvasia, were both famous for painting recognizable portraits that did not involve invention. Obviously, he didn't see the introduction of a dog as satisfactory invention. He cites the Venetian writer Ludovico Dolce's statement that it's not enough for a painter to invent well if he cannot also draw well, because an ugly form makes any invention unworthy. A painter, concludes Malvasia, can always read poetry and history in search of ideas and ask for help with invention, as even Raphael and Titian did. But the work of representation itself, seen here, is his job alone. Only the painter can represent. Malvasia concedes that all of this introduction is really only for the sake of argument, and he said many things for the sake of argument. He did not intend to detract from Domenichino's and Albani's great accomplishments in invention. But if Albani, who loved to read and was never without his dog-eared copy of Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, won the battle with Guido over invention, Malvasia saw absolutely no foundation for claims that he was better than Guido in other parts of painting. This qualitative distinction runs throughout Malvasia's account of Albani's career. And this is a rather wonderful example of the first printing in Genoa of the Gerusalemme Liberata as illustrated with engravings after Bernardo Castello by Agostino Carracci himself. And so in carrying around his copy of Tasso, Albani was really also imitating his teachers. Malvasia relied on Francesco Albani, who outlived his fellow evangelists, as Sganelli called them, except for the reclusive Guercino, for much historical information, and considered him a good man and a great teacher, worthy of respect, if often, as Malvasia says, a little boring in conversation. But from the outset, he dismisses the pointless rivalry of Albani with Guido, in which Albani could only expect to meet with failure. This rivalry, which eventually extended to camps of younger Albanisti and Guidisti in Bologna, began in the early days of Albani's training in Dennis Calvert's studio, where Guido, just 3 years older, set him his exercises in drawing. The two were close, and the competition Albani felt with Guido was clearly of a kind that springs from an intense attraction and admiration. Albani followed Guido to the Carracci Academy, and this drawing in Paris remains anonymous, but it gives a sense of drawing lessons within the academy from, of course, the living, in this case, draped model. He followed Guido to the Carracci Academy, but as soon as he undertook independent commissions, according to Malvasia, he lost no opportunity to set himself up against him. Once in Rome, their competition became more public. Albani was the favored assistant of Annibale Carracci, while also winning major commissions for himself, including the frescoes for Vincenzo Giustiniani at Bassano di Sutri, which was the country seat of one of the richest men in Europe. And this is a very, very wonderful old photograph of Bassano di Sutri, which is now called actually Bassano Romano since 1964. But as I went there even before that, I still want to call it Bassano di Sutri. Guido, whom Annibale never trusted, set himself up, meanwhile, with the wealthy, equally wealthy Borghese, winning papal commissions in the Quirinal and elsewhere. And here, of course, it's a later image, but of the Quirinale, where Guido would conduct great campaigns. Guido would occasionally include Albani in the Quirinal Palace, for example, but always in a subordinate role. And this is generally accepted that the putti in the Quirinal Palace chapel are by Albani. Francesco Albani's sense of being an underdog, of being less respected within the Carracci tradition, and especially with regard to Guido, had much to do with the circumstances of his life, and we'll get to these in a moment. In Bologna, in Albani's declining years, Malvasia listened to the painter's continuing complaints about the attention given to Guido and to Guercino, and his laments about his own lack of success. "What should I do?" he wrote in a letter that Malvasia quotes. "Should I become a house painter or a street sweeper, and from now on just paint crosses for the streets and leave painting for the young, because the old have trembling hands and see nothing?" End quote. The appearance of Francesco Sganelli's Microcosmo della Pittura in 1657 enraged Albani on several counts. It glorified Guido and Guercino. And you remember this is the frontispiece designed by Guercino, which shows the various Lombard schools dominated by the colore of the rainbow. It glorified Guido and Guercino, and it misrepresented Albani's leading role as Annibale's assistant in the Herrera chapel in Rome. giving some of the work mistakenly to Tacconi and to Domenichino. Albani was especially upset that Scanelli praised him only as an artist working on a small scale, ignoring his many altarpieces. Scanelli did in fact mention the famous Annunciation, and it is extraordinary. This is Albani's great masterpiece. It's still in a church in Bologna, and I'm afraid this is the very best image I could get of it, and it's something of a reflection of Albani's, I think, loss of prestige in modern criticism. But Scanelli did mention this famous picture, completed in 1632 for San Bartolomeo di Porta Ravignana, which, as Malvasia reported, was known, as it still is, as the Annunciation dal Bel Angelo, with the beautiful angel, as well as the baptism of Christ for San Giorgio in Poggiale, which Malvasia considered to be, quote, in the most exquisite modern manner and a norm and a model. Like any wounded reader, Albani annotated his copy of the book, which he passed on to Malvasia, and it has, of course, fetched up in all places in Los Angeles. He gave it to Malvasia, insisting on his unique participation with Annibale in the Herrera frescoes and the esteem in which he was held by the Servites in San Giorgio in Poggiale. The elderly painter begged Malvasia to write a rebuttal of Scanelli's text. Given his friendship with both, Malvasia refused, attempting to persuade Albani, unsuccessfully, that any mistakes were inadvertent. Albani was probably not mollified by the subsequent letter from Scanelli sent on May 10, 1658, and published by Malvasia. Scanelli insisted that his book was not a series of lives, which of course Malvasia's was to be, but a study of different perfections, or sufficienze, something he had explained in the Microcosmo, and which should be clear even to the simplest colour grinders, as he put it, and canvas stretchers. And here you see this note where Scanelli calls him a maestro sufficiente, and the inscription says, poteva dire qualche cosa di più che sufficiente. And Albani took that to mean he was just a fairly good painter, he was sufficient. Scanelli tries to turn it into a compliment rather unsuccessfully. He had indeed, says Scanelli in this letter, been wrong about the chapel in San Giacomo, confusing it with the chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo. But in general, he tried to emphasize what was important in Albani's work. And this is the altarpiece by Annibale in Santa Maria del Popolo, and this is the couple of the fresco fragments in which Albani participated, and you can sort of imagine how Scanelli got these two things confused. Nothing Scanelli said, however, could alter the fact that Guido and Guercino remain Scanelli's ideal figures in the Second Lombard School, and that Albani, however famous and extraordinary, was best known, according to Scanelli, quote, for his organization of stories with grace and decorum, especially in the production of small figures. Scanelli was interested in qualities of style and the celebration of the modern manner and the glories of the Lombard school, and especially his hero, Correggio. He did not care for particulars. Malvasia, by contrast, as I've been trying to show in these lectures, set out to combine a new form of critical evaluation of quality with an equally modern documentary and historical approach. It was important to him to explain just why Albani's life and career was such a disaster, determining that his problems were largely brought upon him by his family and ultimately by himself. Now, the quality of an artist's family life played an especially important role in 17th century Italy, providing support or bringing trouble in the developing marketplace for art. A well-ordered household with devoted in-laws and good neighbours, such as that enjoyed on the Pincio in Rome by Nicolas Poussin, could sustain very steady production. This is a very beautiful drawing by Claude Lorraine showing the Trinità dei Monti as it was then in the early 1630s. And Some of you know this as the Biblioteca Herziana, Palazzo Zuccuri, and the house, which we only have a 19th century view of here, of Nicolas Poussin, seen from the doorway of the house of Claude Lorraine. And of course, Poussin lived in this house with his wife and his brother-in-law, Gaspard Duguay. And this intensely supportive and very regular family provided the support for Poussin's painstaking work. The disorderly circumstances, by contrast, of the widowed Orazio Gentileschi's various quarters, by contrast, with none of the domestic harmony that he portrayed in his Lute Player, which is in the National Gallery in London. I've said it again, National Gallery in Washington. I won't make that mistake again. With none of the domestic harmony portrayed in this, exposed his daughter Artemisia to a criminal attack and family dishonor. Malvasia made careful observations about families, finding relatives to be useful sources for facts and documents. The Carracci, of course, provided an outstanding example, for by working together, they accomplished more than anyone could alone. L'abbiamo fatto tutti tre was their famous motto. Guido's Bolognese household, as we've seen it in an earlier lecture, centered upon his mother. And after her death, as we've seen, the painter lived a Spartan and even virginal existence at home while squandering his substance outside. And to take you back again here, Piazza Maggiore, San Petronio, and Guido's workshop, very much in this center of town. And the portrait, which I think is very likely a portrait of his mother, although that has, of course, been challenged. Domenichino loved his beautiful wife, and I'm not really proposing this is his wife, but he used her continually as his model, and Malvasia describes how he enjoyed arranging her hair in a certain way so he could paint it. He certainly loved his beautiful wife almost too much, keeping to himself when he moved to Naples. There, without the social protection of friends, he died from poison among strangers. Guercino, as we saw just last week, flourished in the company of his brother and sister and members of the Gennari family. Guercino never married, but he never lacked competent household management. You remember last week I showed you the accounts for his paintings. Albani's situation could not have been more different. In Rome, his first wife, Anna Euphemia Rusconi, who was no more than 14 at the time of their marriage in 1613, died the following year after giving birth to a daughter, Elisabetta. Her dowry and inheritance became a legal nightmare, lasting for years. On Albani's reluctant return to the family household in the center of Bologna at his brother's behest, Albani married again. Doralice Fioravanti provided him with great happiness, her beauty and that of the children she produced in great number, providing him, as Malvasia put it, with living models, natural embodiments of his amorini. Albani's house here near the canal of the Riva di Reno has not been actually precisely identified, but it's slightly less central than those of Guido Reni and Guercino. Albani's putti were far superior to those plaster figures based on Duquesnoy and Algardi's putti that most artists used, and he painted them in unparalleled numbers. This is a wonderful painting by Swerts, in which we see all the models, all the plaster models in the studio, and right in the center is a little relief after Duquesnoy of putti, including the famous one here, looking through a mask. Malvasia's account inspired humorous mockery in the 19th century, including this painting in Dunkirk, in which we see Signora Albani reaching out for one of her babies who is hanging here in the studio as Albani paints it, preferring the living model to the plaster model that he has on the table. There were sometimes as many as 12 children at home, and although Doralice taught them all to read and was a delightful companion to her husband, says Malvasia, the household was utterly chaotic. This disorderliness was multiplied by the problems bequeathed by Albani's brothers. who incurred vast debts and died intestate, even though one, Domenico, was a lawyer and the other a notary. It was after Domenico's death in 1646 that Albani was reduced to running what has been called a picture factory to pay off over 50,000 lira of debts. Now, this was a huge sum for a man who received just 1,000 lira for one of his 45 altarpieces in 1641. Foolishly trusting Domenico, his brother, a puffed-up bibliophile who hated children, Francesco Albani preferred to spend as much time as possible in his country retreats. At the Villa Querzola especially, the family had created a wondrously verdant locus amenus, which Malvasia compared to the villas at Frascati and Tivoli. It was surely not as grand, but there can be no doubt that the painter of such scenes as this, wonderful image of Diana's nymphs disarming the sleeping cupids in this wonderful landscape, or the Erminia divested of her armor in a very unknown painting and not in the greatest condition in the Galleria Colonna, where we see Erminia, but we also see one of the peasants here, Contadini, digging in his vegetable garden while this is going on. Many of his paintings reflect his vision of cultivated landscape, following the new conventions of the idyllic pastoral established by the Carracci and Domenichino. This rendered them especially appealing to the French landscape architect André Le Nôtre, who owned both of these exquisite early small coppers. They're both on copper. This one has, just here, it's been mounted on wood, but they are painted on copper. And Le Nôtre also owned the somewhat larger Diana and Actaeon, also now in the Louvre, as well as the realm of the heavens and the realm of the earth, which dates to around the early 1630s. All of these, the French gardener Le Nôtre bequeathed to King Louis XIV in 1693, together with several other works, which is why they're in Paris today. Malvasia wasted few opportunities to record Albani's weaknesses. Summoned to Mantua to paint frescoes for the Duke, Albani spent 6 months gossiping and making preparatory cartoons. When Cardinal Prince Giovanni Carlo de' Medici came to Bologna from Florence to invite Albani to paint frescoes for him, the artist did nothing but complain about lawsuits and his family. With regard to his later work, Malvasia reports that the most learned Frenchman, Roger de Pile, was right in saying that when you had seen one work by Albani, you had seen them all. Yet Malvasia also found Albani's ideas interesting enough to wish that he had written up some sort of treatise on painting, together with his friend Dr. Orazio Zamboni, about whom we know very, very little, in the way that Annibale and Domenichino had collaborated with Monsignor Agucchi. Malvasia saved and published Zamboni's notes and letters, and these contain several references to Albani's express wish not to record the story of his life. When he was pressed to leave some sort of memorial for his family, he returned more than once to the frescoes he had helped Annibale Carracci complete in the Herrera Chapel in San Giacomo degli Spagnuoli, as well as, among others, his own frescoes of Phaeton at Bassano di Sutri. Albani would mention the series done for the Borghese, which inspired similar commissions from Cardinal Prince of Savoy, another series of roundels, and the Count of Carouge. We'll be looking at these more in a moment. Once, after a long silence, he responded to Malvasia that he'd painted 45 altarpieces and about the same number of other large paintings, not to mention innumerable middle-sized and small paintings, di capricci di favole e di composizioni, tutte tendenti a novità di pensieri concettosi, which is to say, of capricious fables and compositions that are all, in fact, completely new, with conceptually complicated thoughts. But these, he said, these small paintings with capricious subjects were of very little account. Yet despite many criticisms, Albani remains a pillar of the Carracci school. If we put family issues aside, and again resist the temptation to view him as a painter of putti through the literal eyes of 19th century painters. Here we have another example of the 19th century showing him as a gentleman kind of at ease, watching his children fall into spontaneous kind of compositions that he could then work up into paintings and with his palette in his hand. If we put all this aside, which of course does have its origin in a way with Malvasia's account, is there a way to revise his reputation in a positive way? Now, to do this, we need to read Malvasia's account more carefully and in its entirety. From that great moment of collaboration with Annibale in the Herrera Chapel to the establishment of his own signature style through the exploitation of a new genre of painting, notably those idyllic and playful scherzi poetici, for which he became almost too famous. As recorded by Malvasia, Albani was proudest throughout his life of the work he did in fresco in Rome. The Carracci had made a reputation through commissions for prestigious frescoes in the Grand Manor, Bologna, and in Rome, but culminating in Annibale's Great Ceiling in the Farnese Gallery. It followed that Reni, Domenichino, and Albani would all be involved in fresco commissions in Rome, but it was Albani who gained Annibale's trust when he most needed assistance, and that is to say, when he suffered a nervous and physical breakdown after completing the gallery and before his death in 1609, and was unable to paint anymore. Albani had already contributed significantly to the Aldobrandini lunettes, the influential series of landscapes showing the life of the Virgin for the chapel of Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini. And these are, of course, a very important marker in the development of landscape painting, showing here the Holy Family into Egypt, and this one in which Albani played a major role of the visitation, all of them with wonderful landscape backgrounds. But it was the Herrera Chapel frescoes, in which he was Annibale's principal assistant, that mattered most. These frescoes of the life of San Diego belong to a distinctive current of religious painting around the turn of the century in Rome. Convincing narratives of saints' lives told in a naturalistic way provided visual parallels to the new documentary histories of the Church being constructed by such reformers as Cesare Baronio. I'm sure you're all wondering why these are in Barcelona, but I will get to that point very soon. The commission itself from one of the richest Spanish bankers in Italy, and for his newly built church in the newly built chapel in the Castilian church in the heart of Rome, was an important one. The scale of the figures designed by Annibale was large, something that's completely lost in most reproductions of these dismantled frescoes. And the scenes are, in fact, close in spirit to Domenichino's frescoes for the monastery at Grottaferrata, painted in 1608, very close in spirit, in much better condition, obviously, but you can see here how you have a very simply constructed architectural space with a very clear, miraculous event taking place in each case. The high point in Albani's early career as the heir of Annibale, these frescoes had a short-lived reputation. The church itself, seen here, heavily restored today and turned around in its axis, soon fell into decay, culminating in its deconsecration in 1824. Pellegrino Succi removed the frescoes between 1833 and 35, and they were eventually shipped to Spain, divided between the Museo in Catalunya in Barcelona and the Museo del Prado. And I'm showing you, I'm showing you tonight altogether, I think, the frescoes that are in Barcelona. But here at the Prado, Andrés Ubeda de las Cobos has recently supervised a restoration of the Prado frescoes. And I think we all look forward to seeing the whole remarkable series exhibited together sometime in the near future. Albani was successful in working with Annibale because he'd mastered his manner so perfectly, especially in fresco, and was able to translate sketches into designs and execute them. The imitation of the Roman Annibale was something that all the younger generation with the exception always of Guido, was trying to achieve in the first decade of the century. As a result, the attribution of many works produced around 1603, 1608 has proven difficult, as we saw some weeks ago, or in fact months ago now, in the case of the portrait of Agucci, which has been moved back and forth. The St. Jerome in the Prado, which was once attributed to Albani, today, I believe, goes under the name of Domenichino, but it was also once attributed to Lucio Massari and even to Annibale, and I'm not altogether sure whether this is Domenichino or Albani. The beautiful Rest on the Flight into Egypt, which is now at Princeton, was long given to Annibale, but is now recognized firmly as by Albani. Everyone, it seems, wanted to paint a St. Jerome, a Susanna, and a Pietà based on Carracci compositions. As we've seen, the Pietà, I think we've seen this one before, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dated to 1603, was so close to Annibale, is now firmly given to Domenichino. This used to be in private collection in Great Britain and recently acquired by the Metropolitan. And in that same British collection, Albani's Rest on the Flight into Egypt, again closely linked to Annibale, is still to be found and is just enough softer and sweeter to be firmly by Albani. The Erminia and the Shepherds in the National Gallery in London was given to Annibale himself, to Domenichino, to Panico, and to Tacconi before, I think, being firmly accepted by just about everybody as Albani's. Annibale's death in 1609 broke up this competitive group. Now, before turning to the moment when Albani, like the others, distanced himself from Annibale's grand manner, even while insisting upon his position as his master's heir, I want to consider, as I promised in November, one other project that is closely tied to the Herrera frescoes, while also linking Albani to Domenichino and to the Prado triumphal arch, which we looked at in some detail specifically. And here we have these two drawings, which in their emblematic decoration, their inscriptions, their whole conception, obviously very, very closely related to the triumphal arch in the Prado. And this is the fascinating volume in the Morgan Library in New York, containing scenes from the life of St. Paul, accompanied by texts based on Paul's writings. The high level of finish and consistency indicate that these drawings are final studies, perhaps for a publication that never progressed beyond this fine copy. The narrative scenes inside the volume, which may be by a different hand, I think probably are from the frontispieces, have been attributed to Annibale Carracci and more generally to his Herrera Chapel workshop. I think a strong case can be made to give these 46 drawings, which is a remarkable number, to Albani. Clearly, they represent a sustained effort of invention, even if, as in several cases, there were existing prototypes for the story. In many scenes, such as the curing of the lame man on the left, or Paul led in chains to Jerusalem, the combination of architecture and landscape recalls the work of the late Annibale, as in the Aldobrandini lunettes, and of both Albani and Domenichino. But these drawings are surely not by Domenichino, about whose drawings we know considerably more. The variety of these images, whether by Albani or not, and I really do think we could make a case for them being by him, we have very inadequate sense of his drawing oeuvre, however. This returns us to the question of Albani's strengths in invention, which he himself considered, together with disposition, the first part of painting. Malvasia, you recall, praised him for this above all else, even if, as we've seen, refuting the primacy of invention above disegno and colore, and undermining Albani's achievement by pointing to the repetitive character of his work. The drawings also remind us of Albani's ability to invent religious subjects, and not just those famous scherzi on mythological topics that proliferated on the market across Europe. Despite his criticism, Malvasia preserved a remarkable amount of material concerning Albani's own views on invention. And I shouldn't really say despite the criticism, because it's typical of Malvasia to want to keep together as much original material as possible. His record of the painter's response to the request of his pupil Andrea Sacchi, writing from Rome on November 28, 1651, for an assessment of the small paintings known as bambocciate, after the nickname of Peter van Leer, depicting scenes of daily life. We see here a hostelry, and we see beggars playing cards, and all together surrounded by the ruins of Rome, snacking amidst those ruins. Or another interesting example, this scene of carnival in Rome by another painter of this group, Jan Miel, of the carnival in Rome. The response is especially precious. In this extraordinary exchange, we have both sides of the exchange here, Albani concedes that there is room for a less serious genre of painting, but he argues that it can never take first place. He insists that these artists be distinguished from those virtuosi who aspire for perfection, relying on poetry, imagine Tasso, and history in their search for noble concepts and expressions of grace, combining the useful and the beautiful. One senses from the letters that Malvasia transcribes that Albani had fun writing so passionately against what he calls the forfantoni, the pittocarie, the faldonate, words that are not meant to be terribly pleasant and are not to be found in the dictionary. These kinds of painting were drawing attention in even well-to-do households. In the end, however, he was quite serious in his opposition to this kind of painting by Monsu Bamboccio, by Jan Miel and others, holding them up against the values of Raphael's Farnesina and Annibale's Farnese Gallery. Less well understood is Albani's opposition to the influence of Caravaggio, whom he saw, as did Nicolas Poussin, as causing, quote, the total ruin of the most noble and complete virtue of painting, end quote. It's very much like Poussin saying, this man came to destroy painting. This did not have so much to do with the choice of low-life situations, which we just saw in the case of Miel and others, and which, in fact, Caravaggio really doesn't paint. Following the poet Torquato Tasso's Aristotelian distinction between the imitation of the true, the vero, and the verisimilar, the verosimile, Albani complained that Caravaggio had succeeded only in imitating the appearance of truth, but without representing behavior or the liveliness of movement. The simple imitation of a found object, says Albani, is not an invention. Caravaggio was troppo attaccato al naturale, too attached to the natural, and this had led to devastating results for painting. Albani especially disliked paintings of single figures from the waist up, with no expression, no perspective, no ideas, not to mention, he says, legs and thighs. These half figures, che oggi si celebrano, which are so celebrated today, based on copying entirely from nature, he contrasted with great works by Titian or by Raphael, both of them in another bow to the moderns within Malvasia's text, like Christopher Columbus, showing the way to the future, and like Columbus, leaving all others behind. Writing in July 1637, writing to Orazio Zamboni, in July 1637, Albani complains about history paintings from which he learns nothing, and the fact that students from whom he learns nothing are being praised to the heavens. In Rome, he had seen a painting of a Madonna holding a child who was playing with a swallow on a string. Albani says that by putting a skull in her other hand, he could turn this Madonna directly into a penitent Magdalene. Of course, we saw this picture last week, and this, in Caravaggio's case, we don't even have the presence of a skull. But such childishness, says Albani, is not how real invention works. Another example of the incorrect inventions he saw all around him was a Venus discovering the dead Adonis, in which Venus arrives without a chariot and whose face shows no signs of lamentation or unhappiness. And it's tempting to think that both examples here were drawn from Guercino, whose strength lay in colour and not, as we remember, in invention or in varied action. This painting was a wonderful painting that was destroyed in the Second World War and only known through its engraving, but in which, of course, there is no chariot and in which the expression is somewhat subdued. If he disliked such reduced simplicity, Albani could not tolerate the addition of extraneous ornamental details. Despite his overwhelming passion for Raphael, he criticized the four otiose santi, or lazy, pointless saints, in the otherwise marvelous St. Cecilia in San Giovanni in Monte, Bologna. There was no space for them, he said, and they had nothing to do with each other, nor with Santa Cecilia. In this case, he blamed the patron and not the artist. When his own Annunciation for San Bartolomeo di Porta Ravignana, and still known, as I said, as the Annunciation dal Bell'Angelo, and one of his most mature masterpieces, was criticized, Albani defended its subtle invention. Hostile critics had complained that it was wrong to show the Virgin looking down so far to the ground, as the angel comes flying in, not yet fully landed, and as a result, the angel not showing sufficient humility towards la sua gran padrona. Albani's defense is to point to the importance in a painting of representing more than one single action. Figures must show what they're doing, what they have done, and what they will do. The angel's wings show how he has come from heaven and entered the door, with one little angel holding back the curtain and the other holding a lily as a sign of purity. Mary is reading Isaiah and has reached the point in which the incarnation is foretold. Albani painted these prophetic words, and I'm very, very sorry that we can't get better images of this. He painted these prophetic words in Hebrew. Having seen an angel arrive from on high, the Virgin turns, listens to the news of her eternal purity that had been prophesied. So we have the present, we have the past of the angel coming in, and we have the prophecy of the future. This approach to visual invention ultimately derived from Aristotle, expressing time past, present, and future in a single moment. Albani said he had learned from the Carracci and from Raphael. He found it very much lacking in contemporary painting, in which not even a single expression is shown badly. And he would not, for example, have approved of Orazio Gentileschi's intimate but far more prosaic vision, in which there is only a present moment. It's easy to understand why Albani resisted being characterized as a painter of small work, and we see how ambitious he was for altarpieces. By the 1640s, so many others were working in this small format, including his pupil Mola and, of course, Nicolas Poussin. But northern painters had degraded the format by painting vulgar subjects, as we've seen. And though popular, these works often held a lower status in the marketplace. Yet Albani acquired a unique reputation for the quality of his small works, which were acquired by great connoisseurs. Furthermore, as in the case of the four tondi commissioned by Cardinal Scipione Borghese around 1617, these are not always especially small. The Borghese canvases measure 1.5 meters in diameter. What rendered these small in a critical sense was the relative size of the figures and the settings combined with the playful spirit of their inventions. Malvasia's characterization of these scherzi is full of insight. He reflects that Albani's canvases, replete with joy, happiness, and contentment, reflect none of the painter's sufferings. With his poetico pennello, his poetic paintbrush, Albani was always on the hillsides of Cythera and Pathos, always climbing to the very top of Parnassus. Where Guido painted Amor asleep, writes Malvasia, Albani shows him dancing, shooting targets and fighting, together with other little winged children and with satyrs and fauns. As for Venus, says Malvasia, he always showed her in the manner of the Pronuba, or the goddess of marriage, of the Parthenopean swan. Now, Parthenopean swan is Malvasia's typically roundabout way of identifying the great Neapolitan poet, Giambattista Marino. And here he quotes in the Felsina at length a full 32 lines from Marino's epithalamic poem dedicated to Veronica Spinola at the time of her marriage, Giovancarlo Doria, published in his Pro Nuba Venere, hence the word, in 1617. In these lines, Marino sings of the pennuti fanciulli, or feathered children, who fly around Venus, having hung their weapons on trees, playing and spying on little birds in their nests, collecting fruit, while others defend the wood from satyrs and fauns. Malvasia praises the novelty of Albani's thoughts, the peregrine discoveries that came from his bold and abundant mind. If Albani could not outdo Guido in profundity of design, he sought to do so with his erudite compositions. If Guido made the world fall in love with his sublime beauty, Albani allured the viewer with his seductive charms. Further, in an important statement, Malvasia reports that whereas the magisterial and noble works of Guido were worthy of monarchs and of royal palaces, the vivaci scherzi of Albani are to be seen in the most secret cabinets and in the gardens of famous villas. And this is a rare image of a small gentleman's cabinet where friends can discuss and even touch the sculptures and look at small paintings, a very different context from that of a royal gallery. And a garden which is full of sculptures, but these gardens also very often had small casinos, small houses in which pictures were displayed. Now, Malvasia reinforces this association of Albani's scherzi with gardens by quoting from Luigi Scaramuccia's recently published dialogue, Le Finezze dei Pennelli Italiani, which appeared in 1674. In this, one speaker says that the description of the garden of the Signori Poeti, a family, in Bologna, reminds him of Albani's paintings. His companion agrees, saying these are most suited for such beautiful places, gardens, given that Albani's manner is perfect for joy and happiness. And the first speaker concludes, quote, that the high talent and natural inclination of Albani was always to represent delightful objects, fabulous actions, dryads, amours, nymphs, scenes of the sea and of woods, and other similar and innumerable capricious and poetic fantasies. It's quite a list. Fabulous actions, dryads, amours, nymphs, scenes of the sea and woods, other similar and innumerable capricious and poetic fantasies. This list draws together many of the new subjects of lyric poetry that flourished quite extravagantly in the 17th century, and which may also be grouped under the category or genre of the scherzo. Such poetry has a long history from its ancient origins in the playful poetry of Alexandrian Greece, its modern revival in the Renaissance by such writers as Poliziano and Sannazaro, given a special impetus in the late lyrics of Torquato Tasso, inspiring the Bolognese poets of the Accademia dei Gelati and their brilliant colleague Marino, not to mention the Genoese poet Giuseppe Chiabrera. Angelo Gabriele's Scherzi et Artifici Poetici these scherzi, these poetic inventions, were dedicated to Ferdinando Gonzaga in 1620, and the edition of Marcello Giovanetti's poems, divided as they are into affettuose, boscarecce, nuziale, eroiche, sacre, was embellished with a frontispiece and a portrait by Claude Melin after Vouet, this portrait here, and the frontispiece. The playful poetic scherzo was so popular it could take many forms, including theatrical presentation, as it did in this case in a drama presented in Venice in 1598. The scherzo had no fixed rules, but it took above all the form of the madrigal. The poetic scherzo was often self-consciously opposed to the epic, whether ancient or modern, and it was most often dedicated to pastoral loves, their victories and their defeats. As the scholar Andrea Torre has written, the Baroque scherzo was closely related to the nugae or light poems of Catullus and the miniature paeania of Theocritus and others. In this context, Albani's description of his own small scherzi as capricci di favole, as he put it, of little account, takes on a very particular meaning. Rather than seemingly being self-deprecating, Albani was saying that they were exactly what they were, small things of no account, made purely for pleasure. Yet however light-hearted and small, their composition relied on sophisticated skill, wit, and deep poetic knowledge. They produced delight through encompassing all the parts of much larger poems. The explosion of interest in poetic amorous scherzi around 1600 is quite astonishing. In the competitive world of court poets, the name of Giovan Battista Marino takes first place in this Parnassus. His Lyra, published in 1616, included Amori and a scherzo marittimo, and in 1617 we have here his Eclogue Boscherecce. You can see here amorose, marittime, boscherecce, lugubri, morali, sacri, varie. These are various editions of those small poems. His collection of fabulous and pastoral idylls, La Samponia, appeared in 1620, an extremely influential group of poetry that many people read. These publication dates, in fact, mean little, however, for Marino always claimed to be first among all contemporary poets to exploit these new forms of verse, whether they derived from modern or ancient Italian or Spanish poetry, or were in fact original to him. Or yet more likely, palimpsests of hidden references to earlier poets. After Marino's death in 1625, his reputation only grew, as the epitaph on Vouet's portrait engraved here implies. Marino's Adone was first published in its entirety in 1623, with a dedication to King Louis XIII of France, and only later, as you see here, in Venice. The Adone, which is in fact an interminable epic about love, not about war, consolidated the vision of a pastoral world of the senses, filled with diminutive amorini, those penuti fanciulli and angeletti cited by Malvasia, and home to the wounds and joys of love that flourished in the proliferating scherzi, and in fact so full of love and seductive verse they are, these lines of Marino, that it could only be published in Paris to escape censorship in Italy. And this poet, who prided himself on everything new, became the chief exponent of a poetic form that relied on the constant recycling not only of images, but also of language and vocabulary, of grace, delight, and visual seduction. A great part of the pleasure produced by the new madrigal or scherzo resulted from the reader's recognition of familiar elements, its repetitive deployment of variation within restricted limits, its frequent diminutives, its quindies and its quincies, its very precious language. German scholar Vittoria von Fleming has traced the literary and visual sources of Albani's mythologies for Scipione Borghese, giving due attention to the Marinesque poetry that flourished around the cardinal. What remains undefined, however, is the quality or genre of these works as such, as scherzi, capricci, or eclogue. If we look for a moment at Domenichino's ambitious mythology, The Hunt of Diana, and Annibale Carracci's Large Venus and Adonis here at the Prado, which we've looked at several times, it's easy to see how much they too owe to Titian and the tradition outlined by von Flemming. Albani's brilliantly original works also grow out of earlier pastorals, in which, of course, we should include Ludovico Carracci's Tasesque, Erminia and the Shepherds here in Spain, an important contribution to this genre. But these are quite to the genre of kind of landscape, but not of the scherzo, because they are quite different in scale and concept. And Albani's special status is defined by the fact that, like the verses of lyrical scherzi or poetic fantasiae, his images were repeated by the artist with small but significant variations over and over again. When Cardinal Maurizio of Savoy commissioned his allegorical roundels, which you see here, in 1625, he was surely expecting something resembling the Borghese set. He wanted to emulate the Borghese in his collecting. Prince Giancarlo de' Medici acquired the rectangular series first created for the Duke of Mantua, 1621, and these were eventually purchased, not because the king had seen them, but because he'd seen reproductive engravings after them as a kind of selling point. They were purchased by Louis XIV in 1684. A final set, this time on copper, was commissioned around 1636 by Jacques Le Veneur, Count of Carouge, and who was in fact godfather to Albani's second son, for his chateau. In each of these cases, sophisticated patrons were looking for a delightful and original to them, in which we see in each case specific references to the commissioning patron, repetition and reworking of something desirable, even, I think we can say, fashionable, because already known, and like the scherzi, including many pleasant references to other little works. Now, Albani's pair of mythologies here in the Prado provide an excellent example of such repetition. The Toilet of Venus and the Judgment of Paris are almost exactly the same size and appear together in the 1772 inventory of the Royal Collection. Although, and I've given the Prado's dates here, they may not be exactly contemporary. It's quite possible that one was painted later to form a pair with the other, but I do have a very strong feeling that they form a pair, and be interesting to think about that. I'm not sure that that's reflected in Prado's website. Venus is present in both, in the one adorning her beauty, and in the other being judged more beautiful than Juno or Minerva by Paris. Remarkably, the Judgment of Paris, the later work, is a unique representation of this subject by Albani, which is in itself interesting. Its pendant, however, Albani's reconfiguring, even replication, of a favorite mythological subject is everywhere evident, and I'm going to walk you through that. The subject of the Toilet of Venus had appeared in one of Albani's very earliest projects, the frescoes of the Fall of Phaethon at Bassano di Sutri. This is one of the wall frescoes in which we see Venus admiring herself in a mirror as a handmaiden adorns her hair. At about the same date, Albani expanded the motif into one of his favorite assemblages of Venus's chariot, a cool fountain, and flying putti. And I think it's interesting, this painting, which was long lost, was acquired only in 1972 for the Pinacoteca in Bologna. It's a very important work. In a general sense, this invention derives, as I'm sure you can all imagine, from Titian's Venus worship and from Annibale Carracci's reinterpretation of this work, of which Agucci wrote such an influential description, only the landscape is now more pronounced. But yet more important for Albani was Annibale's own Toilet of Venus, now in the National Gallery in Washington. While so much, including the dressing of Venus's hair, the mirror, the puto carrying the vase, and the sculptured fountain, come from his master Annibale, Albani has already, in this early rendition, now in Bologna, made his radical move towards a small-scale delicacy and playfulness, and towards an emphasis on the pastoral landscape garden. And yet the move, I have to concede, was not so thoroughly radical, for this too was originally one of a pair. Its pendant, the landscape with Diana and Callisto, being painted by Annibale himself. As is so often the case, Annibale pointed the way. This would not be the way for Guido Reni, and nor would Guercino be tempted by it. The new kind of classical idyllic landscape appealed to the young Domenichino, but it became Albani's stock in trade. The next step in the refinement of this idea was the toilet of Venus in the Borghese cycle of roundels, and the group around Venus is closely paraphrased in our Prado scherzo, very, very closely paraphrased. In the Gonzaga, Medici, Louis XIV cycle, the whole scene becomes more elaborate, with complex theatrical architecture and Venus's chariot in the sky. But the central group, now even including the Putti investigating Venus's jewel box, is a play on the Borghese tondo, and again repeated in our Prado painting. And here, as I call it, our fountain makes its entry. Whereas the early painting in Bologna had a circular fountain with the upper vase supported by fauns, the almost identical fountains in the Prado and Louvre paintings show dolphins surrounding the pedestal at the bottom, and the upper basin is now held up by nude male figures. And this is a very beautiful section of the Prado picture in which a sculpture is seen almost to be alive. We see more clearly in the reverse print after the Louvre version that it's exactly the same. In the center of that upper bowl, two nude figures support a third who blows on a thin pipe. This group was another favorite configuration. In Albani's Dance of Cupids in Dresden, itself based on what would become his most popular easel painting, then in the Sampieri collection in Bologna, this one. In this image now in Dresden, three putti take up the same pose on a monument, piling up on a globe to show that love conquers everything. A relationship with Annibale and Titian's Feast of Venus remains clear, but in each case, Albani is also thinking, and this is a surprise, I think, of Mantegna's Bacchanal with Silenus, in which, as in the Dance of Cupids, the figures are seen now frontally, with two satyrs supporting the drunken Silenus. We have here again a detail of the Prado painting. The male figures holding up the upper basin, on the other hand, would recall, I imagine, to any Roman visitor in the audience, the fountain outside Palazzo Mattei, where Albani had in fact worked in his earliest years. The famous turtles here were a later addition. We see it here more exactly as Albani would have known it. Now, the status of novelty or originality in a culture in which imitation or the authority of tradition was prized is, as I've argued in my extended discussion of the Domenichino affair, the central issue of Seicento culture. And I really can't discuss this at all tonight, but the argument being, of course, that this work by Domenichino was the first work in the history of painting to be accused of plagiarism. The artist was accused of plagiarizing, obviously, the model provided by his teacher Agostino. And in working through how that claim could be made, I made a strong argument about the role of novità at this moment in the 17th century. We need only glance at a handful of Albani's religious images, especially his Holy Families, to see that they too work within a deliberate structure of variety upon a theme, one that owes much to the tradition established by Raphael and Annibale Carracci. In this work of emulation, he was no different from Domenichino or Nicolas Poussin. See them here working in a very similar mode. Albani also followed his teachers, the Carracci, in inspiring his students, which Reni, Domenichino, and Guercino did not really succeed in doing. He could not, however, maintain the Carracci tradition alone. one of his great middle career works, but a very beautiful painting in Galleria Colonna. The production of a proper funeral for Albani was scotched by enemies in what Malvasia called l'altra scuola, which is to say, the Guidisti. The best Malvasia, who understood both his strengths and weaknesses, could do was to print an extract of the description and a program that had been prepared. The best we can do, I hope, is to look at Albani's work afresh. Guided by Malvasia, we can see how it was that Albani came to constitute a future for painting. If, as we saw last week, Guercino's paintings were taken by Napoleon as trophies of war to serve paradoxically, given the artist, as an academic example of a typical career, Albani's little works went to France freely, in considerable number, and as messages of love and peace. Even as Marino's Epic of Peace, the Adone, which had first been printed without censure in Paris, would freely appear in its first illustrated edition with plates by a French artist in 1678. This kind of image would have been altogether too much for the censors in Italy. And in fact, of course, it was published in Amsterdam. In sets designed like scenes in the illustrated Adone, theatrical performances at Louis XIV's lyrical and pastoral retreat at Versailles were populated by amorini, by nymphs, by sculptures, and by fountains. This wonderful vision of Versailles, which is so close in its inspiration to the images in the illustrated Adone. These theatrical performances took place in the gardens designed by Albani's great admirer, André Lenotre, the landscape designer, who had in fact, and we see here two marvelous scenes of the garden, who had acquired the allegories of heaven and earth from the Count of Carouge upon the latter's death in 1653. When it came to painting, Albani's repetitive, playful, amorous delights were fundamental to the arrival of the Rococo and the modern delights of Watteau. The poetic and pictorial scherzo, and this I think is an interesting comparison here, the way in which these images of the loving, playful putti are transcribed by Watteau into a different mode, but very, very much the same purpose of joyful love. The poetic and pictorial scherzo was still going strong in 1795, and you're seeing here the images by the Portuguese artist Teixeira in this wonderful volume of Scherzi Poetici Pittorici, published 1795 in Parma, which had an enormous success. So at this point, on the eve of the French Revolution that would bring a return to sterner values, the scherzo was still going strong. In the end, even if he ended life feeling a misunderstood failure, the best teacher among the Carracci pupils, who counted Poussin, Vouet, and Claude among his followers, had an overwhelming effect that reached far beyond Italy in the creation of the Rococo style. Thank you.